Guten Tag. This is part 9 of my history of the Russian Germans, and this will continue the 1930s following the Holodomor. And it will concentrate mostly on the 1937-1938 Great Terror and the German operation, which disproportionately targeted ethnic Germans, particularly those in Ukraine and Western Siberia. I did not hit the Volga region nearly as hard. And this will hopefully bring us up to 1939 or 1941 even on the chronology here that we're progressing through. So the main thing in the 1930s that we see that's relevant here that I will be talking about is the move from repression of class enemies such as the kulaks to repression of enemy nationalities, ethnically defined enemies, enemies of people that are racialized in that their ancestral categories, their ethnic heritage becomes an immutable category that they automatically inherit due solely to biology, and which they cannot assimilate out of, and which their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren cannot assimilate out of. That is, that just like other racialized categories, such as those based upon skin color in places like apartheid South Africa, having been born into the category, one is trapped in it forever, and one's children are trapped in it. And there is a never-ending line of a centralized primordial existence based upon this ancestry, going back and forth, even if the cultural signifiers completely disappear. All right, so this is something that happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Already during collectivization, a disproportionate number of Germans and Poles being targeted as kulaks on the basis not of their wealth, but on the basis of their ethnic ancestry, that is, being descended from, in the case of the Germans, immigrants from Central Europe into the Russian Empire. So we see this already during collectivization, people enforcing the deportations, talking about that Poles or Germans are kulaks by nature, that it has to do with their culture, and that this culture is essential and primordial and cannot be removed through processes of assimilation, that it will always exist and has always existed. And so this is where we see the fact that the kind of distinction that many Soviet apologists try and make between ethnicity, which they kind of put the category of Nationalnost in with, and race does not actually exist. Nationalnost, in point of fact, particularly after April 1938, when there was a specific decree saying that you can only inherit the Nationalnost of your parents, and that you cannot change it during your lifetime, becomes a racial category. It becomes functionally indistinguishable from what exists, again, as I said, in places like South Africa under apartheid from 1948 to 1994. But even when there is some flexibility to Nationalnost, that it functions more as an ethnic category than a racial category. That is, you can change it through assimilation over a period of time. We see the shift in the Soviet repression. So in 1935, a large number of Germans deported for being German from the western borders of Ukraine into the eastern Ukraine. But most of them return because they're just kind of dumped out there. And so the Soviets then in 1936 have a more permanent and repressive forms of national deportation from the border region of ethnic Germans and ethnic Poles. In June 1936, 27,000 Germans and Poles, mostly Poles actually, deported into northern Kazakhstan as special settlers. And then in September 1936, another nearly 13,000 Germans and Poles sent to special settlements in Kazakhstan, where they movement and ability to choose their place of residency is restricted. Now, these groups are deported not because of their class, but because of their nationalnost, their ethnic designation, and the geographical territory that they are inhabiting. But this will soon move to not just specific geographical areas, but entire national groups defined solely upon ancestry. And this will occur at the same time as the Great Terror, with the mass deportation from the Soviet Far East into Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan of the Koryo-Saram, or ethnic Koreans living in the USSR. But already we have national deportations of Germans in 1936 from the border with Poland, and in 1941 we will have the deportation of almost all ethnic Germans under Soviet rule in the western parts of the Soviet Union to Siberia and Kazakhstan during the fall of 1941. But in between these first deportations on the border of Poland with ethnic Germans and ethnic Poles, and the beginning of the Second World War, with the mass deportation of over 80% of the German population of the Soviet Union into Siberia and Kazakhstan, and a fair amount were already in Siberia and Kazakhstan for various reasons. We have the German operation as part of the Great Terror. Now, the Great Terror has three main components. But first, overall, the Great Terror is the arrest of about 1.5 million people during 1937-38. These people are convicted, and about half of them, so 750,000 people, are shot. And the other 750,000 people are sent to labor camps. And now, the three components of this Great Terror are the Great Purge, which is aimed at the elite at the top, members of the Communist Party, members of the officer corps of the Red Army, the old Bolsheviks such as Bukharin, Kamenev, Zinoviev are tried and executed as part of this Great Purge within the Great Terror. Various Soviet generals, and such as Tukhachevsky, also executed at this time. But overall, in terms of numbers, the Great Purge, the attack on the elite, is a small portion of the Great Terror, about 50,000 executions. So it still leaves us with about 700,000 people executed for other portions of the Great Terror. Now, the largest group, with over 400,000, is the Kulak operation. And most of these people, although not all, are people that had been accused of being kulaks and deported to special settlements during the forced collectivization of agriculture, and then escaped to either the cities mostly or to other areas, and were now being rounded up and dealt with in a permanent fashion by execution. So this is the largest number, some 800,000 people arrested, half, some 400,000 shot, the other half sent to labor camps. Mostly people accused of being kulaks had some modicum of property, a couple of cows, or they hired one or two farm laborers, or people that just ideologically opposed collectivization, didn't want to join the collective farm even though they weren't particularly rich, or people just arbitrarily accused of being kulaks regardless of their social economic status or ideological or political position. Right, that happened as well. And so these people, along with some of the other, quote, old remnants, former people, people that had been members of the Tsarist officer corps or owned land during Tsarist times, landlords, the nobility, uh, been certain members of the Russian Orthodox hierarchy. A number of these people were also rounded up and shot at this time, along with some other class enemies. But most of the class enemies at this time that were being finished off, and this is the last attack on class enemies as opposed to ethno-racial enemies within the borders of the Soviet Union before 1940. All right, so there will be more class enemies obviously coming into the Soviet Union with the annexation of the Baltic states, Bessarabia, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, but within the territory of the Soviet Union before the 1940 expansion. The 1937-1938 Kulak operation is the last attack on class enemies as opposed to ethno-racial enemies. So all of the class enemies after this time are to the west of the Soviet borders in 1939, before the 17th September 1939 Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. So we look at specifically then the next component, smaller than the Kulak operation, the national operation. And these were operations aimed at people accused of being spies or diversionists or agents of influence for specific foreign powers. But they, in all cases, disproportionately targeted and aimed at the diaspora groups that were ethnically, culturally tied to those states, and it becomes racialized during this time that moves from being an ethnic categories to a racial categorization. So what happens is, while obviously there were people that were accused of being spies for these regimes that were not members of the diaspora, most of them were. And in the German operation, it's some 2/3 of people accused of being spies for Germany or otherwise working for the German state were ethnic Germans, particularly in Ukraine, especially around Odessa, also a large number in western Siberia, particularly Novosibirsk. Interestingly enough, comparatively very few in the Volga region, other than at the very top of the communist hierarchy of the Volga German ASSR, comparatively quite few Volga Germans. The largest number of people targeted, arrested, and executed during the German operation from the German diaspora in the Soviet Union came from Ukraine. All right, so these operations claimed in total about 250,000 executions. and the largest one, with about 110,000, was the Polish operation, and somewhat over half of the people executed in that operation were ethnically Polish. So a lower percentage than Germans in the German operation, but a larger still number of ethnic Poles overall shot than Germans, and certainly a much larger percentage of the population because there are fewer Poles ethnically in the USSR than Germans. But the German operation certainly coming in at number 2, both in terms of sheer numbers of people shot and as taking a toll percentage-wise from the German population. In terms of not percentage-wise, in terms taking a toll in total numbers, sorry, from the German population. So some of the other smaller operations had much higher percentages. Latvian operation, Estonian operation, the Iranian operation, very, very high percentages. But the numbers are much smaller. But in total numbers, the German operation, the second largest national operation. Right? So not in terms of percentage. The percentage is quite high, but it's not the highest. But certainly number 2 in numbers after the Polish operation. So wanted to get here in April 1938, the Soviets, NKVD, has a circular which states that nationality, nationalnost, can only be inherited from your parents, that it cannot be changed at all during your lifetime. And that, of course, that means that then transmitted automatically to the next generation. And so this fits the criteria for race expressed by people like George Fredrickson, both in his many theoretical works, but also many practical works on race in the US, Brazil, and South Africa. That if a category is based upon ancestry and lineage and descent, and it is unchangeable, immutable, and is inherited automatically upon birth and transmitted automatically to the next generation, with no ability to change through assimilation, then it is in point of fact not a ethnic category, not a national category, but a racial category. All right, so the signifier here is ancestral language. All right, so if your ancestors were German speaking and immigrated into the Russian Empire, then you are deemed to be German through some sort of essence, and your descendants also to be German through some sort of essence. This cultural essence is never really defined. The Soviets reject biological and genetic justifications, but this idea that anybody whose ancestors were Germans and is themselves German, no matter how assimilated into Russian culture and Soviet way to life, is in practice and functionality exactly the same as a system based upon biological or genetic justification for categorization along basis ancestry. And in point of fact, the reason I bring up South Africa is the South Africans also rejected genetic and biological justifications for race. To them, skin color was a signifier of differences that were cultural and historical and ethnic, but they never said that they were based upon a genetic inferiority or a biological weakness. All right, and this is the same thing you see in the Soviet Union. The idea that people who have German descent were inherently untrustworthy, inherently loyal to the German state, inherently counter-revolutionary and enemies of the Soviet state on the basis of their ancestry. Right? So they don't need the genetic or biological justification the way you see in Nazi race science. Instead, they have anthropological, ethnographical, sociological, historical pseudoscience to back up their claims. But in function, it's basically the same. And the marker of language and culture has been used in many forms of racism, most notably anti-Semitism in Europe itself, before it got a brief heyday of biological claim. But obviously, very similar in the idea of culture rather than biology being something that is primordial and essentialized and cannot be changed, even if it's obvious that there is no culture there, right? So this happens in 1938, the racialization of nationalnost. It becomes an ethno-racial category because you automatically inherit at birth and it can't be changed. It can't be assimilated out of or into another group. So what do we see in the German operation as far as numbers? In total numbers, and not all of these people are German, obviously, as I went over, 55,000 convictions and almost 42,000 death sentences, of which some 67% are ethnic Germans. So we're talking around 38,000 convictions, of which 29,000 are shot. The remainder are sent to labor camps. So a much greater percentage than the total percentage for the Great Terror as a whole. That is, more people are shot versus being sent to labor camps. And then we look at the German population. The 1937 census is incomplete. It doesn't count everybody. But even so, it's interesting to note that the German population in the 1937 census is 50,000 people less than the German population in the 1926 census. And not all of that loss can be accounted for by the fact that there are large groups of Germans not counted, because you would also have to account for the fact that normal population growth is still occurring from during this time, and the population therefore should be much larger or significantly larger, but it's smaller, and this is due to two factors. One, the large number of people, particularly Germans in Ukraine, that starved to death in 1932 and 1933, but also the fact that these people had far fewer children. If you starve to death before you can reproduce, you have 0 children, right? So the population not only doesn't grow, but you don't replace yourself. And this birth deficit, I think, is noticeable in the 1937 census. The 50,000 less, I haven't gone in and delved into details as to what the difference between people who are not being counted, because whole regions are not counted for the German population in the 37 census, and which ones are a result of excess mortality and birth deficit during the 32-33 famine and afterwards. But it's something to bear in note that 11 years later, the next official census counts fewer Germans than the 1926 census. But this is the number we have to deal with. And so, while it's inexact, it does show that we're talking about 6% of the German population being arrested, and some almost 5% being shot. Now, let's compare this to the Soviet Union as a whole. So this would be using this comparison. The fact that these numbers are incomplete becomes less of a problem. We have less than 1%, 0.8% of the Soviet population arrested, which is quite high, 37, 38, and half of these people, 0.4%, being shot. So the number of people being arrested and shot among the German population compared to the Soviet population as a whole is disproportionately very large, although it's smaller in percentage-wise than a number of other diaspora groups that are smaller in total number than the Germans. So we're talking here fairly significant number of Germans being arrested. And in addition to the German operation, there were a number of Germans arrested and tried and convicted and even executed during the Kulak operation. So there may have been as many as some 70,000 Germans arrested during the Great Terror, and over 50,000 of these being shot, and 20,000 sent to labor camps. The majority of those being shot, some 29,000, being during the German operation itself, which means they were being specifically targeted on the basis of their German ethno-racial categorization, particularly after the April 1938 NKVD clarifications, noting that Nationalnost is inherited biologically from one's parents. It is therefore race. It is not any different than the way the South Africans were categorizing people as black and white in the apartheid era after 1948. All right, you inherit it from your parents, and you can't change it. You can't assimilate in or out of it, and you can't choose it. Right, that's what makes it a racial rather than an ethnic category. And this will, of course, extend throughout the Soviet era, but particularly we'll see how this use of the Nationalnost as an ethno-racial category is used in wide-scale repression during the Second World War, particularly against people who are of German ancestry. Right? They can't escape this. They can't make a claim that, well, we've assimilated into Russian culture. We've assimilated into Ukrainian culture. Even in the cases, and this happens quite a bit in terms of loss of language in the post-Stalin era, in the 1970s and 80s, large numbers of ethnic people descendant of German immigrants into the Soviet Union have culturally lost all of the signifiers that would have made them German, but they are still classified by the Soviet government as being German based solely upon their ancestry. So, I don't have too much more. This has gone on for almost a half hour, but I've got the numbers there, and we have the most important thing here: the move from class-based enemies to ethno-racial enemies, and the solidification and the transformation of ethnicity into a racialized category, particularly for repressed nationalnosti, those that are subject to national operations in 37 and 38, and starting with the Koreans in 1937, wholesale national deportation. And the Germans will meet this fate in 1941, which will be the subject of the next presentation. I'll talk about what happens during the Second World War, and it will probably be a rather long presentation, and it will probably be a while before I get to it. But as I said, we're entering the very dark chapters. So we have here the shooting of almost 29,000 ethnic Germans on the basis of them being German during the 1937-1938 Great Terror and the German operation within that. And so while the numbers are comparatively small to the numbers who died in the Holodomor in 32 and 33, and the numbers who died during the Second World War due to forced deportation and mobilization for forced labor into the labor army, it's an important transition point because now ethnic Germans are being targeted for repression on the basis of being of German ancestry and lineage, being German by race, rather than because of their class and social economic status. All right, I'll leave it at that.